Have you ever stopped to think about how the news you get day in and day out is actually shaped? I mean, it's not just about reporting events, right? There might be these unseen forces behind the scenes.
It's a huge question. What if the very way our media is structured systematically filters what we learn, kind of subtly guiding how we see the world?
Exactly. And that leads us perfectly into today's dive. We're tackling a really landmark piece of work, maybe unsettling for some, Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent, the political economy of the mass media.
It's a foundational text, really. Our mission today is to unpack their central argument, the propaganda model.
Right, this idea that even though it looks like there's tons of media diversity out there, the system as a whole largely works to support and defend the interests of, well, dominant power groups.
And we'll dig into the 5 core filters they identified. These are like the invisible mechanisms that decide what news is considered, fit to print and what just gets pushed aside or ignored completely.
Get ready for some potential aha moments here, because we're going to explore how this system works, often without any conscious plotting, and how it shapes public views on really critical stuff, from wars overseas to politics right here at home.
Okay, let's jump into this framework, the propaganda model. Herman and Chomsky aren't saying the media is one single voice. Not at all.
No, they acknowledge debate happens, right?
Yeah,
Especially when powerful groups disagree on how to handle things.
precisely. But, and this is the absolute key viewpoints that challenge the fundamental assumptions of state power or point to systemic problems. Those tend to get systematically shut out. That's the core of the model.
So if it's not some secret committee deciding everything, how does this filtering happen? How is it so built in?
That's where the 5 filters come in. They call them the essential ingredients. These are the things that effectively sift through everything, marginalize dissent, and basically let the government and dominant private interests get their main messages across.
Okay, let's list them out. First, the sheer size, the concentrated ownership, the immense wealth of owners, and the profit-driven nature of big media companies.
Second filter, advertising. The fact that advertising is the main source of income.
Third, the media's heavy reliance on info from official sources, government, big business, and the experts, often funded by them.
Fourth is what they call Flack, basically, negative feedback or pressure used to discipline the media if they step out of line.
And fifth, historically, was anti-communism, used as a national religion, a control tool, though you could argue that evolves into other isms over time.
Yeah, the specific ideology might shift, but the function remains similar. And what's really striking is how these filters don't work in isolation. They reinforce each other.
Right, creating this environment where, as they put it, only a specific sort of cleansed residue of news makes it through. It's also really crucial to grasp what Herman and Chomsky stress here. Journalists themselves often operate with total integrity.
Absolutely. They genuinely believe they're being objective. It's just that the constraints, the filters are so powerful, so deeply embedded in the system that alternative ways of selecting and framing news become almost unimaginable.
They don't need an editor telling them, don't print that. The system itself guides the choices subtly.
Exactly. So let's unpack that first filter: size, ownership, and profit. Think about how the press became an industry. Setting up a newspaper used to be relatively accessible, but the costs just exploded over time.
You mentioned the London example from the book, going from needing modest sums in the early 19th century to needing millions just decades later. That barrier to entry is massive.
It inherently leads to fewer, bigger players controlling the information landscape. And this concentration hasn't slowed down. Herman and Chomsky pointed out that even back then, around 20-something huge media systems controlled over half the output across all major media papers, TV, books, movies.
Just a handful of corporations setting the agenda for the most part.
And deregulation, especially, loosening rules on cross-ownership in the 80s, just poured fuel on that fire. It led to more takeovers, companies taking on huge debt.
Like the CBS example, taking on $1 billion in debt just to fight off a takeover bid. That kind of financial pressure forces an intense focus on the bottom line, right? Profit above all else.
Absolutely. And when the owners themselves are incredibly wealthy billionaires with vast media holdings, they naturally have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. The system works for them.
It's not necessarily about dictating headlines day to day, but about setting the overall direction, hiring top people who share that worldview. It's structural.
Which brings us neatly to the second filter. Advertising is the primary income source. This is huge. Basically, media outlets need ads to survive, or at least thrive.
If you can attract big advertisers, you can sell your paper or magazine cheaper, maybe even give it away. That puts outlets that don't attract those big ad dollars at a massive disadvantage.
It effectively gives advertisers a kind of de facto licensing authority, as Herman and Chomsky put it. Their choices directly impact who succeeds and who fails.
And this hits dissenting or alternative voices particularly hard, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like working class papers, their readers might not have the purchasing power advertisers are looking for.
Exactly. The Daily Herald example in Britain is just chilling. Here's a paper with almost double the readership of the Times, the FT, and the Guardian combined in its last year.
Wow.
And it died. Why? Lack of advertising support. And think about what's lost. A whole different framework for understanding events just vanishes from the mainstream.
And beyond just survival, advertisers shape the content too, right? They prefer stuff that's, well, safe.
Generally, yes. They want programs that lightly entertain, things that won't disturb the buying mood. Complex, controversial topics, those might scare off viewers or advertisers themselves. It's safer to stick with content that keeps people passive and receptive.
Makes sense from a business perspective, but not necessarily for an informed public.
Oh.
Okay, filter number 3, sourcing. Where does the news actually come from?
Well, the media needs a constant flow of raw material, news. And economically, it makes sense for them to put their reporters where news is likely to happen consistently.
So places like the White House, the Pentagon, City Hall, the official centers of power.
Right. It's what Mark Fishman called the principle of bureaucratic affinity. They develop a symbiotic relationship. The officials provide easy, reliable copy, and the media give them access and prominence.
And the sheer scale of information coming from these official sources is just immense, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely staggering. Herman and Chomsky cite figures like the Pentagon decades ago, publishing hundreds and hundreds of magazines and periodicals, way more than the biggest commercial publishers. They have huge PR operations.
Compare that to, say, a peace group or a small nonprofit trying to get their message out.
The disparity is enormous. They use the example of the American Friends Service Committee. Their entire press operation was just dwarfed by the output of even single branches of the military. It's like a fire hose versus a dripping tap, whose information gets amplified.
And it's not just the volume. It's about who gets labeled an expert.
That's the co-opting the experts part. Powerful interests, government, corporations can fund think tanks, hire academics for consulting, sponsor research, essentially creating a steady supply of credible-sounding voices who tend to support their perspective.
So these experts then get quoted widely in the media, reinforcing the dominant narrative.
Precisely. It looks objective, but the very pool of experts is often shaped by underlying power dynamics. Okay, filter 4, Flack.
Flack. So this is basically negative feedback, complaints, attacks.
Exactly. Negative responses to a media story or program. And if that flack comes from powerful sources or is well-funded and organized, it can be really costly for media outlets.
How so? What kind of costs?
It can mean advertisers pulling out, campaigns demanding boycotts, political pressure. It makes outlets think twice before running controversial stories that might attract that kind of organized heat. It disciplines them.
And who generates this flack?
It can be direct, like a call from the White House complaining about coverage, or it can be indirect through funding organizations specifically set up to monitor and critique the media, often from a particular political viewpoint.
They mention groups like Accuracy in Media, AM, or Freedom House.
Right. And the interesting thing is, Herman and Chomsky note, these flack machines, even though their role is often propagandistic and tied to corporate or political agendas, they tend to get respectful coverage themselves. Their funding and motivations are rarely scrutinized in the media they attack.
Okay, that's subtle but powerful. And the fifth filter, anti-communism, historically.
Yeah, historically, communism was positioned as the ultimate evil, a threat to property, to the established order. It was an incredibly effective tool for mobilizing public opinion against perceived enemies.
And because the term itself was so broad and, frankly, fuzzy,
it could be weaponized against almost anyone challenging the status quo. Not just actual communists, but social democrats, reformers, anyone seen as threatening powerful interests or advocating accommodation with adversaries.
it created a climate where just labeling something communist was enough to discredit it, often without needing much evidence.
Exactly. The demand for proof could be suspended. Unreliable sources, defectors, could be presented as credible experts, even if their stories didn't hold up later. The Dominican Republic example they use is illustrative. a democratically elected leader quickly undermined by fears of communist infiltration, leading to a U.S.-backed coup.
Okay, so those are the 5 filters. Now, let's see how they work together in practice.
Yeah.
One of the most powerful illustrations in the book is this idea of worthy versus unworthy victims.
It's a stark concept. The argument is that a propaganda system will consistently highlight the suffering of people abused in enemy states. They become worthy victims, deserving of our outrage and sympathy.
Whereas people treated just as badly or even worse by our own government or its allies, they become unworthy victims. Their suffering is downplayed, ignored, or rationalized.
The comparison they draw between Jerzy Popieluszko, the murdered Polish priest, and religious figures killed in U.S. client states in Latin America is just devastating.
Tell us about Popieluszko. Poland was seen as an enemy under Soviet influence.
Right, so his murder in 1984 became a huge international incident. Front-page news in the New York Times multiple times, vivid, repeated details of the brutality, savagely beaten, rope tied around his neck. The media conveyed this intense sense of outrage. He was a worthy victim.
And then you look at Latin America during the same period. Priests, nuns, even an archbishop murdered in places like El Salvador or Guatemala, countries heavily backed by the U.S.
Their stories received minimal coverage. Often they weren't even named. Details of torture or mutilation were glossed over, reported succinctly, if at all, and certainly not repeated endlessly. They were unworthy victims.
The 4 American churchwomen murdered by the Salvadoran National Guard, even though they were Americans, got a tiny fraction of the coverage Popieluszko did.
Less than a tenth, according to their analysis, and the details were sanitized.
And Archbishop Romero, assassinated while saying Mass in El Salvador.
Initially, the media played dumb about who might be responsible, despite strong evidence linking death squads, the military, and eventually the far-right politician D'Aubusson. It just wasn't treated as a major scandal implicating the U.S.-backed system itself.
The trial for the churchwomen's murders, too. They describe it as basically staged, tied directly to U.S. aid money being released once a verdict came down.
Yeah, judges resigned in fear, the defense lawyer fled after being tortured, and the aid money flowed right after the conviction to the very minister of defense who headed the guard responsible for the murders. That context, largely missing from the mainstream narrative. It's a chilling example of how political utility determines whose suffering matters in the media landscape.
This selective lens applies to politics, too, especially elections, right?
Absolutely. Look at the contrast in coverage of elections in Central America in the 80s.
Okay, so in U.S. client states like El Salvador and Guatemala,
The media narrative was all about struggling towards democracy. Lots of focus on voters lining up, smiling faces, the positive imagery. But the context of intense political terror, massacres, the fact that no genuine opposition could even run because their leaders were killed or in exile, that was systematically downplayed or ignored.
So the elections were presented as legitimate steps towards democracy, despite the reality.
Pretty much. The army essentially ensured only candidates acceptable to the U.S. and the local elites could participate safely. But then compare that to the coverage of the 1984 election in Nicaragua.
Nicaragua, which the U.S. government opposed.
Exactly. Even though international observers generally found the election fair, noted the lack of mass killings compared to neighbors, the U.S. media narrative was overwhelmingly negative. They focused on alleged coercion, voter apathy, constantly looking for flaws, demonizing the Sandinista government. It was a completely different frame.
And the MiGs that weren't there story really highlights this disinformation aspect.
Oh, that's a classic. Right during Nicaragua's election week, the story breaks supposedly Soviet MiG fighter jets are being delivered. The media ran with the U.S. official line, painting Nicaragua as this aggressive threat.
But the MiGs never arrived.
Never arrived. It was, as Herman and Chomsky state, a concoction of U.S. officials, timed perfectly to disrupt the election narrative and damage Nicaragua's image. The media largely failed to question the premise or the timing.
Wow. Okay, let's turn to how these filters shape the coverage of war itself. The Indochina Wars, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia are major case studies in the book.
They argue the media consistently framed U.S. involvement as defending South Vietnam against communist aggression.
Even though the historical record shows the U.S. actively blocked elections mandated by the Geneva Accords, installed client regimes, and then directly invaded.
That context of U.S. aggression was largely absent from the mainstream narrative. The framing was crucial. And even when elite opinion started to shift against the war, it was mostly framed as a tragic mistake.
A mistake meaning costly, perhaps unwinnable, but not fundamentally wrong or immoral.
Exactly. The idea that the U.S. intentions were noble, that the cause was basically righteous even if the execution was flawed, that remained largely intact within elite circles and much of the media. Questioning the fundamental nobility of intent was rare.
And this ties back to the worthy-unworthy victim dichotomy in covering atrocities, too.
Definitely. U.S. atrocities like the massive B-52 bombing campaigns or events like the My Lai massacre were often downplayed, excused, or presented as isolated incidents, aberrations. But when the enemy committed atrocities, say shelling an orphanage—
Instant massacre headlines.
Right. Civilian deaths caused by U.S. firepower were framed as the unfortunate tragedy of war, while similar actions by the other side were evidence of their inherent barbarity. Double standards were pervasive.
And Laos, often called the secret war.
It's largely invisible in the U.S. media, despite the U.S. conducting perhaps the heaviest bombing campaign in history there, utterly devastating large parts of the country. When it was covered, reports often excused the U.S. actions or focused narrowly on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, obscuring the wider destruction.
Cambodia is another really stark example in the book, with two distinct phases.
Phase 1, 1969 to 1973, the period of intense U.S. bombing and ground incursions that killed huge numbers of civilians, created millions of refugees, literally turned parts of the country into moonscapes. These Cambodian victims of U.S. actions.
Unworthy victims, minimal media attention, their suffering largely ignored.
Almost entirely excluded, even with masses of refugees right near reporters in Phnom Penh. But then comes Phase 2, the Khmer Rouge takeover in 1975.
Pol Pot's regime.
That period was framed as a Holocaust. It received massive, sustained media attention. The victims of the Khmer Rouge were absolutely worthy victims.
And the contrast between the lack of coverage for Phase 1 and the intense focus on Phase 2, without really connecting the U.S. role in creating the conditions for Pol Pot's rise.
A textbook example of the propaganda model in action. The media's gaze followed the political utility of the suffering.
Even the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, often held up as the media finally turning against the war.
They argue that interpretation needs nuance. Yes, the coverage portrayed Tet as a military setback for the U.S. and its allies, which did trigger Flack from pro-war groups claiming the media was too negative. But that criticism itself operated within the assumption that U.S. goals were fundamentally good. And Herman and Chomsky point out that official military assessments at the time were often more pessimistic than the media's reporting. The media might have questioned tactics or prospects for victory, but rarely the underlying right of the U.S. to be there in the first place. The adversarial stance had clear limits.
So, wrapping this all together, what does this model tell us about the media's overall role, its societal purpose, as they call it?
They used the Watergate scandal as a kind of controlled experiment. Watergate got intense media scrutiny. Why? Because it involved powerful domestic actors whose rights and positions were directly threatened by Nixon's actions. They could fight back, and the media amplified that fight.
But when illegal actions or abuses affect marginalized groups or distant victims of U.S. military actions, or impose costs spread thinly across the whole population.
Media opposition is often muted or non-existent. The watchdog doesn't bark as loudly or at all unless the interests of the powerful are directly challenged. That's the argument.
So the media allows, even encourages, debate and dissent, but only within certain boundaries.
Exactly. As long as the criticism stays faithfully within the system of presuppositions and principles that constitute an elite consensus, it's not about conspiracies or direct orders, usually.
Journalists internalize the norms. They gravitate naturally, as they say, towards covering Khmer Rouge victims, but suppressing details about atrocities in, say, East Timor committed by a U.S. ally like Indonesia.
That's the idea. They convince themselves and largely believe they're being objective. But the very definition of objectivity, the selection of what's newsworthy, is shaped by these underlying filters. As they conclude, the media are indeed free for those who adopt the principles required for their societal purpose.
It's a powerful and, for many, a deeply uncomfortable analysis of how our information environment works.
It really is. This deep dive into Herman and Chomsky's manufacturing consent lays bare this argument for a structural bias built right into the political economy of mass media. Not necessarily conscious manipulation day-to-day, but a system that naturally filters news in ways that tend to uphold the interests of established power.
But it's interesting, they don't argue the system is totally monolithic or all-powerful. They mention the Vietnam syndrome, for instance.
Right. That persistent public skepticism about U.S. military intervention long after the war ended, polls showed a majority viewing the war as fundamentally wrong and immoral, diverging significantly from elite opinion, It shows that public consciousness isn't entirely captured, that counter-narratives can take hold despite the filters.
So the system is powerful, but not absolute, which leaves us, the listeners, you, with a really critical question, doesn't it?
It does. Knowing about these potential filters, these structural biases, what does that mean for how you consume news every day? How do we foster that truly vigilant and courageous press needed for democracy when the very system has these built-in tendencies?
How do we look past the headlines, understand the framing, and maybe seek out those alternative perspectives that the filters might be marginalizing?
That critical engagement, that awareness, that's maybe the key takeaway.